In the summer of 1995, children began seeing bloody apparitions in South Korea's most luxurious mall, begging them to leave. Days later, over 500 people would vanish into its depths. Join us for this haunting true crime documentary. In today's episode of True Crimes Unfold, please note that events and scenarios in this video may be graphic for some viewers. Discretion is advised. Details of the videos are taken from actual case files. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're listening from, what type of cases you'd like us to cover next, and we'll make sure to add them to our list. And don't forget to subscribe to get new stories as soon as they're released. Now settle in, get ready, and let's begin. In the summer of 1995, children began seeing bloody apparitions in South Korea's most luxurious mall, begging them to leave. Days later, over 500 people would vanish into its depths. Join us for this haunting true crime documentary, told in soft-spoken ASMR format, perfect for late-night listening. From ghostly warnings to corporate greed, uncover the chilling story of how a building became a tomb. Warning: contains disturbing content. The flames dance across our faces as I lean forward, my voice barely above a whisper. The night is perfect for this story. The kind that makes you question everything you know about the structures we trust. Let me tell you about a building that got hungry. Not the usual settling of concrete and steel, but something far more sinister. It happened in Gangnam, South Korea's crown jewel of luxury, where even the air feels expensive. Picture the most beautiful mall you've ever seen. Salmon pink against the sky, rising like a monument to wealth itself. 5 floors of marble and glass, where $1,000 coats were considered casual wear and $8,000 tea sets barely raised an eyebrow. The Sampung department store wasn't just a building, it was a statement. But buildings have memories. They remember every corner cut, every lie told, every pound of weight placed where it shouldn't be. And sometimes they try to warn us. It started with the children, little ones, tugging at their mother's sleeves, eyes wide with terror. "The Ajushi," they'd whisper. "The bleeding man is telling us to leave." Their mothers would look around the pristine aisles, seeing nothing but mannequins and luxury. They'd laugh it off. Children's imagination, they'd say. But the warnings kept coming. A security guard doing his rounds at 3 a.m., footsteps echoing through empty corridors. He'd pause, hearing something like a dragon's groan from above. On the 5th floor, he'd find a hole in the ceiling, not broken through, but pushed down, as if something massive was pressing from above. The air grew thick that June. The mall's massive air conditioning system struggled, leaving customers sweating in their designer clothes. But it wasn't just the heat. There was something else. A weight in the air, pressing down on everyone inside. The walls began to weep. Water trickled down expensive wallpaper, leaving trails like tears. The floor developed a tilt, so subtle that most didn't notice how their shopping bags would slowly slide across tables. How display items would migrate to one side of their shelves overnight. 20 days before the collapse, a young mother named Mina was shopping in the children's section. Her 6-year-old son suddenly froze, staring at empty air. "The bloody Ajushi," he whispered, "says we need to leave right now." Mina looked around the pristine store, seeing nothing but smiling staff and gleaming displays. She kept shopping. That's the thing about warnings. We only recognize them in hindsight. The building was trying to speak in its own way, trying to tell us what was coming. But no one wanted to listen to a building's screams. Would you like to know what happened next? When all those warnings went unheeded? When 502 souls learned too late that sometimes the monsters aren't creatures of flesh and blood, but of concrete and steel. But perhaps we should take a moment first. After all, what I'm about to tell you, well, let's just say, it might change how you look at buildings forever. Let me tell you about the final 20 seconds. Yes, 20 seconds. The length of a Korean happy birthday song. That's all the time they had. But first, you need to understand what it feels like inside a building that's decided to die. June 29th, 1995. The air inside Sampung was different that day, like the building was holding its breath. The temperature had climbed to unbearable levels. The AC systems were failing, though we'd later learn why. In the basement, a young clerk named Sarah felt something impossible. A cold breeze. There were no windows, no exterior doors, just solid concrete and that inexplicable wind. Up on the 5th floor, in the food court, plates began to slide off tables. The floor had tilted 15 degrees. Imagine trying to walk on a slope that steep. But people adapt, don't they? They simply held their cups a little tighter, moved their chairs a little closer to the wall. Humans can rationalize anything. At 5:52 p.m., an assistant manager ran through the 5th floor restaurant section, screaming for everyone to evacuate. Most ignored him. There had been too many false alarms. Besides, where there's luxury, there's denial. No one wants to believe disaster can touch the wealthy. Now, let me tell you about those 20 seconds. At 5:57 p.m., the ceiling of the south wing began to crack. A spider web of fissures spread across the pristine surface, dropping fine dust onto the heads of shoppers. Second one. The first support column punched through the roof. Second 3. The 5th floor's restaurants, with their massive industrial kitchens, began to sink. Second 5. People started running. Second 7. The lights went out. Second 10. The floor dropped 6 feet in a single moment. By second 15, the building was consuming itself from the top down. Floor after floor, each level pancaking onto the one below. Imagine 5 stories of concrete and steel, each weighing as much as 100 delivery trucks, falling one after another. The last 5 seconds, well, those belonged to the screams. And then, I pause, letting the silence settle. Where a luxury department store had stood moments before, there was now only a concrete grave 20 feet high. But this isn't a story about death. It's a story about what happened next, about the people who survived in the dark, trapped in pockets of air, listening to the building settle around them like a living thing. Some would survive for hours, others for days. A few, well, they would endure things that would make you question how much suffering a human being can endure. You see, there are 2 types of horror in this world. There's the quick kind, the 20 seconds of terror as a building falls. And then there's the slow kind, the horror of being buried alive, of waiting in the dark, of hearing other survivors slowly fall silent one by one. Would you like to hear about those who waited in the dark? About Michael, who survived for 11 days by drinking rusty water and eating wet cardboard? Or about Gia, who spent 13 days watching concrete slowly descend toward her face, inch by inch? The fire pops loudly, making someone jump. But perhaps we should take another moment. Some stories, well, they need to be digested slowly. Like the building itself, they can overwhelm you if you take them in too quickly. I add another log to the fire, the fresh wood hissing softly before catching flame. Let me tell you about darkness. Not the kind that comes when you turn off your lights at night. I'm talking about the absolute darkness that exists beneath thousands of tons of concrete. The kind of darkness that becomes a living thing, that presses against your eyes until you start seeing things that aren't there. Michael found himself in that darkness. A 21-year-old shoe store clerk who should have been worrying about his architecture studies, not whether the concrete pressed against his face would finally give way. In his concrete coffin, barely larger than a bathtub, Michael could only lie in a fetal position. Every breath brought the taste of pulverized concrete. Every movement risked disturbing the precarious balance of debris above him. But humans aren't meant to lie still forever. That's when he heard her. A woman's voice cutting through the darkness. For a moment, he felt joy. He wasn't alone. There were 3 of them at first. Michael, a 25-year-old kitchen shop worker named Ian, and an elderly customer they called Auntie. The auntie could barely speak. A concrete slab was slowly crushing her chest. Between gasping breaths, she told them about her daughter, who had just turned 30. They tried to keep her talking, to keep her hoping. But in that darkness, hope is as fragile as the air pockets keeping you alive. First, the auntie went quiet. Then Ian's voice grew weaker until her last words echoed in the void. Tell my family I love them. Michael was alone again, but now the darkness was filled with the memory of their voices. Day 3, or maybe it was day 4. Time loses meaning in the dark. Something wet hit Michael's forehead. Not the clean drops of water you might imagine, but rusty, gritty liquid that had filtered through layers of concrete and metal. He was so thirsty, he didn't care. He tilted his head back, letting each precious drop fall into his mouth. By day 7, he was eating wet cardboard, torn from boxes trapped with him. The acid in his stomach felt like glass. But hunger is a patient torturer. It waits until you have no choice but to feed it whatever you can find. Meanwhile, above him, Gia was living a different kind of nightmare. For 13 days, she watched the concrete ceiling inch closer to her face. Each time the rescue machinery moved above, more weight would press down. She could measure the remaining space by how far she could lift her head. I want to go on a date with my rescuer. When they finally pulled her out, reporters asked how she felt. She joked about wanting to date her rescuer. People laughed, not understanding that humor was the only way to process 13 days of watching death creep toward you, centimeter by centimeter. I leaned back, letting the firelight cast shadows on my face. But here's the true horror. While Michael and Gia survived, others remained trapped. Some survived the initial collapse only to drown when firefighters' water, meant to extinguish fires, filled their air pockets. others? Well, some spaces in that concrete maze still hold their secrets. They say that even today, children passing the site sometimes stop and stare at nothing. When their parents ask what's wrong, they speak of bloody figures trying to find their way home. But perhaps we should pause here. The next part. Well, it explains why some buildings keep their ghosts, why some tragedies refuse to be buried under new construction and fresh paint. I stir the dying embers, watching red sparks drift upward into the darkness. Let me tell you about hope and how it can be the cruelest thing of all. 4,000 rescue workers descended on the ruins of Sampung. Each of them carried the weight of knowing that every second they spent being careful could cost someone their life. Picture a game of pickup sticks, but make the sticks out of concrete and steel. Make them weigh tons. Now imagine knowing that one wrong move could send a shaft of concrete through someone barely clinging to life beneath. They couldn't use heavy machinery. Every chunk of concrete they moved was lifted by hand, passed along chains of volunteers. Some rescuers crawled into spaces barely wider than their shoulders, following the sound of tapping, of voices, of hope. Sound design. Water dripping, getting progressively louder. But time wasn't their only enemy. The summer rain came, relentless. Water that could drown survivors trapped in air pockets. Water that turned rescue paths into muddy graves. Water that scattered the infrared signals from their heat-detecting equipment. A woman's desperate scream, "My children are in there!" The families gathered at the edges of the disaster. Some brought photos. Others brought their children's favorite snacks, believing, hoping that hunger would lead them home. A mother stood for days in the same spot, convinced she could hear her daughter calling from beneath the rubble. Then came the mannequins. The rescuers would spot what looked like a hand, an arm, a leg poking through the debris. They'd dig frantically, only to find store mannequins. But they couldn't stop digging, because the next arm might be real, the next hand might still be warm. Day after day, they pulled out bodies, some still clutching shopping bags, some embracing, final moments spent trying to protect each other. A father still holding his daughter's hand, their fingers intertwined in eternal farewell. But the true horror came with the hyenas. While rescuers dug with bleeding hands, thieves crept through the ruins. They stripped jewelry from bodies, grabbed designer bags from beneath the rubble. One was caught wearing 10 pairs of stolen pants, claiming he was just trying to keep warm in the summer heat. And then, on the 11th day, a miracle. Michael's voice, weak but alive, calling out from his concrete tomb. The rescuers dug for hours with renewed vigor. When they finally pulled him out, he managed a weak wave to the cameras. Hope flickered back to life. But hope can be cruel. They had plans to bring in the heavy machinery, to begin the grim task of recovery rather than rescue. Michael's survival changed everything. If he could live for 11 days, maybe others could too. I leaned forward, shadows deepening on my face. But what they found after that, the stories of those final survivors, that's perhaps the darkest part of all. Because sometimes surviving can be worse than dying. And sometimes the real monsters aren't the ones trapped in the dark, but the ones who put them there. Would you like to hear about the aftermath? About justice that came too late and memories that refused to fade? About a memorial hidden away in the mountains because some truths are too ugly for the gleaming streets of Gangnam? The fire has burned low now, just glowing embers casting shadows as I share the final chapter. Let me tell you about justice and how sometimes it looks exactly like a luxury apartment building standing on the graves of 502 souls. You see, the story of Sampung didn't end when they pulled the last survivor from the rubble. In many ways, that's where the real horror began. Chairman Lee, the man who built his fortune by cutting corners and counting one, received 7.5 years in prison. 7.5 years for 502 lives. That's about 5 days per death. His son, who knew the building was failing but kept the stores open to protect the summer sales, got 7 years. Would you like to know why they kept the mall open that final day? $400,000. That's what the mall made in daily revenue. They had already moved the artwork. But here's where the horror truly lives, in what happened after. The families begged for a memorial, like the one at Ground Zero in New York. The government's response: it would decrease property values. Instead, they built luxury apartments. Progress, they called it. They did build a memorial, hidden away in the mountains where tourists won't see it, where it won't remind anyone of uncomfortable truths. 502 names carved in stone, surrounded by trees, instead of the city lights their owners once knew. Remember Mr. Jung, the father who lost 3 daughters, including the blind professor who had overcome so much? He was given $600,000 in compensation, the price of 3 lives. He donated every win to the schools and charities his daughters had loved, saying, "Money means nothing. I just want to fulfill their dreams before I go." Today, if you walk through Gangnam's glittering streets, you'd never know what happened there. The salmon pink building is gone, replaced by steel and glass monuments to progress. But sometimes they say, children still stop and stare at empty air. They speak of bloody figures who want them to leave, to run, to live. The Ajushi says we need to leave. You see, the true horror of Sampung isn't in the collapse. It's not in the days spent in darkness or the bodies pulled from concrete tombs. The true horror is that it could happen again. Because somewhere, right now, another chairman is looking at safety regulations and seeing only numbers to cut. Next time you're in a building, any building, listen carefully. Listen to the groans of steel and whispers of concrete. Because sometimes buildings try to warn us. The question is, will we listen? The last ember dies, leaving us in darkness. They say the souls of Sampung's victims still wander Gangnam streets, looking for justice that never came. But perhaps the real ghosts are the ones we carry inside. The memories of a society that valued profit over people, that built its prosperity on foundations of sand. Sleep well tonight, my friends. But remember, sometimes the most terrifying monsters aren't the ones that hide in darkness. They're the ones that build our buildings, sign our safety inspections, and decide that some lives are worth risking for a day's profit. This final part wraps up the story while connecting past to present, emphasizing both the immediate tragedy and its lasting implications. The focus on systemic horror and lingering consequences provides a satisfying but chilling conclusion. that should leave viewers thinking long after the video ends. The entire series maintains the intimate ASMR-friendly storytelling style while delivering increasingly intense revelations. Each part builds on the previous ones, creating a complete narrative that serves both as a true crime documentary and a horror story, perfect for late-night viewing and the target audience of true crime horror enthusiasts who use such content as a sleep aid.